All right. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are, or good morning to some people as well, and those who are joining from the US. This is such a pleasure to welcome you all to the first event of the iShore Institute for Social Science, Humanities and Oceanic Research. And I'm Dr. Mahmoud Kuria. I'm a research fellow at Leiden University and also visiting faculty at Ashoka University in Delhi. And I'm very delighted to welcome you all to this session, especially Professor Jos Gommans, as well as Professor Michael Tharakan to the inaugural lecture of the iShore. And as part of this lecture, my fellow traveler in this, Divya Kannan, will explain most of the activities what we are planning, who also will chair the session. So I welcome all of you once again to the session and also all the audience to the event. And to you, Divya.
Thank you so much, Mahmood. On behalf of iShore, which stands for Institute of Social Sciences, Humanities and Oceanic Research, I'm extremely delighted today to officially chair the first webinar of our annual 12-month-long series. But before I hand over the mic to our main speaker for today, I also wanted to welcome you all to this initiative that has brought together scholars from Kerala, within India, and across the world, as you can see. And we also wanted to give you a slight glimpse into why we are here today and what is the relevance for us being here at this particular historic moment. It might seem rather pedantic to say this, but for the last few decades, a lot of research on India and particularly in South Asia has been dominated by narratives from Bengal. And we know it's been very, very Calcutta centric. So, in a way, as a mode of correction, but also to encourage scholarship on other regions in the Indian Ocean context, we are very pleased to kickstart this initiative. But iShore also has a larger social goal behind it, and that is to encourage and hopefully train a younger generation of scholars currently based in Kerala or who are interested in working on Kerala in the coming years. And for those of us who have been fortunate enough to have received some of the best training available in both public and private universities in India and abroad, it goes without saying that we are concerned about the future of humanities and social sciences, both in the state of Kerala and in the country. So, at a very difficult political moment and in a juncture where humanities is under great assault across the world, we are only doubly pleased that we could come together to start this initiative. In short, iShore is interested mainly in forging a global community of scholars and practitioners. We are interested in bringing together scholars across the disciplines to look at Kerala as more than just a province, more than just a case study. We want, and that is why Professor Jos Gommans' work on Dutch sources in South Asia is going to be an important entry point for us today. And iShore is hopeful that in the coming years, we will be able to build this global community and to have a wider conversation on research in the Indian Ocean context. So Kerala, not just as an empirical site of investigation, but also a place of reimagining and re-articulating some, unfortunately commonsensical narratives. So be that maybe Eurocentrism or Bengal centricism, we are hoping that we can shift the terms of the debate in the coming years. We encourage you to participate in our future events. We have a series of talks planned for this year. We, in particular, encourage you to pass on the message to your students and colleagues who are now looking for new forays as part of their research explorations. And I'm going to hand over the mic to Dr. Meera Muralidharan, currently at Wellington in New Zealand. She will be introducing the speakers. Um, Professor Gommans, you will have about 40 to 45 minutes to make your presentation, followed by Professor Michael Tharakan's comments and reflections for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then we will be opening the session to the larger public for question and answers. Some housekeeping rules, we request you to please keep your mic muted at all times. You may be tempted to also switch off your video, but I think as a matter of encouragement for the speaker. If you can turn on your video, that would be great. Please also add your comments and questions in the chat box. You could also put in a private message to Mahmood directly, or you could put it for everyone to see. Over to you, Meera.
Thank you so much, Divya. Again, welcome everyone from joining us from all parts of the world. I thought I had the easiest task to introduce the speakers until I realized that it's a huge volume of work they have done. And to bring that into a few minutes of introduction is not an easy task. But keeping in mind the time limit, I'll try to make it as brief as possible. So it's a matter of personal joy for me to introduce our speaker today. As a former student from Leiden University and as a researcher working on early modern history and with a particular interest in Dutch history in Malabar, it gives me immense pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker. So before that, let me share a memory. 7 years ago, when I was a student at Leiden University, I remember attending this lecture on the history of South and Southeast Asia and being completely mesmerized by the connections the professor was drawing about these regions. It not only encouraged me to think beyond India, but also sparked my interest in global history. It was not just history, mind you, that the professor taught, but also how important referencing and footnoting is for a historian. So even till date, when I do my referencing and footnoting, I remember Professor Jos J.L, the speaker of our event today, who is a professor of Colonial and Global History at Leiden University, the Netherlands. Professor Gommans has written extensively on various topics, of which I'll name a few. He has written extensively on Mughal India, early modern Islamic empires, South Asian Islam, VOC history, Indian Ocean, intellectual history, Dutch and Dutch Orientalism. Gommans studied history in Nijmegen and Leiden. His PhD thesis focused on the 18th century horse trade between Central Asia and India, which is published as The Rise of Indo-Afghan Empire, 1710 to 1780, later republished in 1999 and in 2018. Since 2011, while serving as the chair of Colonial and Global History, Gommans' research focused on the early modern cultural encounters between Europe and Asia. He initiated the archival guide series about Dutch sources of South Asia, which is a must-have copy for anyone working on Dutch sources of South Asia, and also authored volumes of the Comprehensive Atlas of the Dutch East India Company. And in 2015, he co-edited the work exploring the Dutch Empire, agents, networks, and institutions, 1600 to 2000. There are many more books which I don't want to mention here, but I would like to mention some of the programs that he has led in recent years. Since 2012, he was the director of the Cosmopolis program, which offered academic training to mainly Asian historians who studied the Dutch archives on Asia and Africa. His other projects also included the making of religious traditions in Indonesia, history and heritage in global perspective, and the Erasmus Mundus program on India. The Cosmos Malabaricus project, about which we will hear today, is his most recent project, which is a 7-year collaborative work which aims to bring VOC archives pertaining to Kerala to more accessible to a wider audience. Alongside Professor Gommans, equally gracing our inaugural session today is Professor P.K. Michael Tharakan, Chairman of Kerala Council for Historical Research, or KCHR. Again, an eminent public figure and a scholar, Professor Tharakan has held various prestigious positions in his career. He was Vice Chancellor of Kannur University from 2009 to 2013, Sri Ramakrishna Hegde Chair, Professor in Decentralization and Governance, Institute for Social and Economic Change in Bangalore, visiting faculty at School of Social Sciences in Kottayam. He specializes in the areas of social and economic history, development studies, decentralization and local government, literacy and education. His recent works include history of the process of the marginalization in the society of Kerala, Gandhian and Marxist approaches to decentralized governance. He is the chief collaborator of the Cosmos Malabaricus project in Kerala. In short, we couldn't have asked for a better panel today to speak on Cosmos Malabaricus project. We'll be hearing from the experts on the Cosmos Malabaricus project and how it is going to open a unique window to Kerala history. Thank you.
Professor Gommans, I would request you to begin your presentation.
Well, thank you, Divya, and also thank you, Meera, for this very generous introduction and also very personal one. It's really nice to be in touch with some of my former students, especially in the context of iShore. And I understand that this is the first webinar, so I really feel privileged to be part of that and to share with you the ideas that we developed in Leiden, but also together with our colleagues in India about Cosmos Malabaricus. Perhaps you were talking about footnotes. Perhaps I should begin with a footnote by saying that I'm not at all a specialist on Kerala history. So my role here in this project is a facilitator. My main research is really focusing on Central Asia, North India, Iran, and then at some distance also, let's say, the Dutch relationships with Asia. And that is also why perhaps, I'm the one who, I'm representing the partnership on the Dutch side of Cosmos Malabaricus. So, so this is I think it's important to make this disclaimer because the kind of comments that I'm going to make is to talk about the project and also make perhaps some historiographical observations. But these observations are from the outside, and I would love to have a discussion with you about the state of the art of the, let's say, early modern history of Kerala, or the Malabar coast, as we say in Holland. Because I think, you made already a comment, Divya made a comment about, the Calcutta-centered field of South Asian studies, and perhaps it would be interesting also in the context of Cosmos Malabaricus to talk about, let's say, the position of Kerala history in the discipline in general, both in India and also beyond. So it's called Cosmos Malabaricus. So what does it mean? Of course, it's some people think it's misspelled because shouldn't it be Hortus Malabaricus? And it's, that's also is, I think, the first thing that I should stress is that it is inspired by the Hortus Malabaricus, and that's why we call it Cosmos Malabaricus. And I think that most of you will know the Hortus Malabaricus, and even lots of people beyond India know the Hortus Malabaricus. Meera is actually currently has worked on it, just finished her thesis on it, more or less. There are lots of people actually working on it right now. So I thought to start with something that people will recognize and see how we can connect the project to something that is inspiring. At least it was inspiring for me. Several years ago, I was really surprised to be when I visited, Kerala, and I was in this museum in Edapalli, in Kochi. To my surprise, I found there this figure, Van Rede tot Drakensteen, as a kind of a puppet, sitting next to Iti Achudam. So in a way, I thought, okay, I didn't know it was that popular in Kerala. So that's one other reason why perhaps I was inspired by the Hortus Malabaricus project, because it also connects to, let's say, very basic teaching and what people know in Kerala itself about, the presence of the Dutch East India Company. And perhaps they even know somebody like Van Rede tot Drakensteen, who started this Cosmos Malabaricus. At the same time, I think it should be clear. So it's saying inspiration, but. So what is this but? The but is that it's not, often, especially in the Netherlands, if people talk about it, it's seen as a kind of Dutch project. 17th century, mid-17th century Dutch project. It's not even, I think, of course, it is an Indo-Dutch project. So in that sense, it is a precursor of the project that we are going to introduce today. But it's even much more than Indo-Dutch. It's really cosmopolitan. So if you look at the list of names that can be associated to it, then it's certainly not Dutch. It's not even Indo-Dutch. We have people from various backgrounds, also various social backgrounds, various religious backgrounds. So in that sense, I'm afraid that Van Rede tot Drakensteen claimed it too much as his own project. And of course, he kidnapped the whole project from Kerala. And let's say at the behind the facade, you have a lot of, let's say, cooperation that's going on. And I guess his own role was a facilitator, perhaps as well. but perhaps the main difference with me is that, you know, he was actually not saying that he was a facilitator, but claimed authorship himself. So I think that's enough for the Dutch role in this project. So it's inspiration, but okay, let's be clear that the Dutch part is perhaps not even primary here. And also, if I look at the people now, you know, joining into this session, I think you know, there are just a few Dutchmen involved. So this is the inspiration point. A little bit more about the inspiration. Here we have the Kodam Puli. It's a plant coming from Kerala. You see already we have, well, it's all Malayalam. So in a way, we are dealing with a vernacular culture. But then we have Malayalam in Latin. We have Malayalam in Aryazutu script, a script that is really coming up, as I understand. So please correct me if I say something stupid later on. But I think Aryazutu is a script that really comes up in the 17th, 18th century. And then we have Malayalam in Arab, and there's also Konkani there in Nagari script. So again, you know, for the project, it's not really important, but it is important to stress that, you know, I'm inspired and we are inspired as a group by, you know, a kind of partnership that is really at the basis of the Cosmos Malabaricus project. And I will elaborate on that later on. Now, who are the partners in this project? I think I should explain the basic, you know, things also of the project. So first of all, not first of all, but one of the partners is Institute for History of Leiden University. So that's why I am based at Leiden University. We actually have two research institutes. So apart from Leiden University, there is the Kerala Council for Historical Research, also representative here today by Professor Tharakan. We will hear about later, you know, what kind of what part is taken by KCHR in the project, but it's very much something we do together. And then, of course, there is the cooperation between research institute that focus on history and archives. So the project is basically about the archive and opening up the archive and making the archive more accessible. And I think for various reasons, that is really of great importance. There's also a cooperation with the State Archives Department of the Government of Kerala, SADK, but let's say the four main partners in the project as for now are the four that I mentioned. What is also interesting, I think, is that it is in the Dutch project because the funding is coming from the Netherlands and from India. So I've chaired several projects in the past where the Netherlands cooperated with Asia, and then most of the funding came from the Netherlands. And now I'm really, you know, of course, you know, it's not 100% sure yet whether we will be able to start this year, but let's hope for the best. But it seems that about 50% is being funded by the Netherlands and 50% by India. And of course, it's still, you know, work in progress that we have to do, and hopefully there will be more funding coming forward, perhaps even beyond our two countries. So it is Indo-Dutch, but hopefully also we can connect to many people that are working on Kerala at the moment. So this is, I think Meera referred to it already. I think in Leiden we have a long tradition of cooperating with Asia and in bringing, let's say, Asian students to Leiden. It started already in 2000 under my colleague, Professor Blussé. He started the project towards an age of new partnership. And now I think we are coming at the close of Cosmopolis Advanced. So the idea behind these projects are that there is a huge Dutch archive, which Dutch historians have studied, but basically, especially in the past, primarily because they were interested in the Dutch Empire or about the Dutch overseas. And that what we really need is a kind of input coming from colleagues in Asia, not only about their own country, but also about other Asian countries where they want to work on. And so I think in the beginning, there was still the idea that people would come from Thailand and work on Thailand, and people would come from Kerala and work on Kerala. But I think it's also high time that that people that work on that are coming from, let's say, Calcutta, are also working on other areas than their own area, so to say. So it is important that scholars from India work on Kerala, and scholars from Kerala should also work on, for example, Thailand. So I think that's also a bit the spirit of the program. That relates also to the, let's say the Indian Ocean atmosphere in which we all work, and where we can see that Kerala is not Kerala, but Kerala is made Kerala because of its many connections to the outside world. So Kerala is really a hub in the Indian Ocean. Of course, and that's also why the Dutch material is interesting, because the Dutch are interested in Malabar, but it's only one of their factories. And of course, for them, it was also important to link up Malabar to other areas in the Indian Ocean. Let me just add one thing, is that what is really becoming very hot in this country is and what is really high on the agenda, especially also in the National Archives, for example, is the hope that this will also contribute to decolonizing the colonial archive. So what does it mean? Well, for me, it's something that is, okay, when I started to be a student, for me, it was already clear that we should not use this archive primarily for our colonial history, but that we should use the archive as a window, so that's also the title, as a window on the local and regional history of Asia. So I think if you look at the more than 160 students that have studied in Leiden in these programs, I think they have contributed a lot on, and in particular, on Asian history, much less so on Dutch history overseas, so to say. And so I think, and in that spirit, I would like to continue. And I'm really happy that now even the archives is becoming aware that, it's nice to have an archive, but there's a problem, it's in Dutch. So how many people in the world read Dutch? So it's really important to decolonize the archive, to make it accessible to people that don't read Dutch. And also, I should also add that perhaps, from my point of view, it's the decolonizing should also be about localizing the archive. So to make sure that people that are interested in various local histories in Asia will be able to use the archive and exploit the archive. So this is the, let's say, that the Leiden stories that hopefully continues in that sense. But if it's also clear that we are gradually moving towards Asia. So as I mentioned already, Meera is, and also Mahmoud, are just two they're also coming from these projects, and they are two of 160 people. And of course, the Dutch world is small. If I look at the let's say scholars that are really have training in the use of other archives, and also including Indian archives, I think it's a massive community, and I think it's important that we continue and also think about what can be done, with the enormous amount of expertise that is available right now. Also on the Dutch archive, so not only on the other archive, but also on the Dutch archive, there are quite a lot of people that should be able to read it and use it effectively. So this is about it, and I'm also glad that Lennart Best, my colleague from Leiden, is here, because he played a very prominent role in what I would like to tell in the during the next slide. It is about the archive, and it is about opening up the archive, but the project is not about digitizing the archive, because that has been done already in the past. And Lennart Best, my colleague in Leiden, played a very important role in this, especially in opening up the archive in Chennai. So we are dealing with, it seems we are dealing with Kerala, with Malabar, but we should keep in mind that, let's say, by far, most of the archive is not in Kerala. There's only a little bit in Ernakulam, but most of it is in Chennai, because it houses the old Dutch factory archive. The Dutch factory archive is still in it's in a bad state, as you can see on the left picture. So on the left, you can see how it looked like when the team arrived, and then some time later, you see what happened as a result of the activities of the delegation from the National Archives. So what I was saying is that most of the material is not in Kerala, it's in Chennai. It's also one of the complications with collaborating with India. It's often okay, you want to work on Kerala, but what you're going to do with Chennai, because that's a different state. So it also creates all kinds of let's say bureaucratic problems that we have to deal with, and hopefully we will be able to master them. But okay, so we have in Chennai, there's the Dutch Factory Archive, and at the same time we have the Netherlands National Archives in The Hague, where there's a lot of overlap with the Dutch Factory Archive, but in the Dutch Factory Archive there's also different material from the material in The Hague. In The Hague we find the materials that have been sent from Kerala to Batavia, so the headquarters of the Dutch colonial empire, and then from Batavia back to the Netherlands. So it is basically, so if we are talking about the archive that should be opened and that should be made more accessible, then we are primarily dealing with the collections in Chennai and in The Hague. And so that is something we should have in mind. And keep in mind that everything is already accessible. So you can go to the website of the National Archives, and then you can find, all the materials that we are dealing with. So the project is not so much about digitizing stuff. It's really about how we can make this enormous amount of digitized stuff more accessible to each and every scholar, historian, or anthropologist, whatever. So I think I should also stress that it's not only for historians, for the sake of historians. I think lots of people I think will find interesting materials in this historical archive. So, of course, I guess but perhaps I should say it, that it covers the 17th and 18th, early 19th century, also more the second half of the 17th century than the early part of the 17th century. But it covers the so-called Dutch period, which of course is not a Dutch period in Kerala, but for the sake of convenience, I will call it the Dutch period now for now. What are the objectives of the project? So it should produce a database. So it means that the already digitized stuff will become more accessible by making a database that is connected to the letters that were being sent from Cochin to Batavia and to the Netherlands, but also at the, let's say, the proceedings of the Cochin Council. And then I think by far the most, let's say from the local point of view, by far the most interesting collection is the so-called inheemse dagregisters, the indigenous diaries. So all that stuff, all these three categories are already digitized, but we hope to create keys, let's say thematic keys, to make them more accessible and let's say more directly accessible for those people that will be able to read, let's say, the Dutch material. Because if you just have, let's say, a starting knowledge about, let's say, reading knowledge of Dutch, it's then it's really very, very complicated to start, with this, with an archive that is so huge. So where to start? Where should I go? So we would like to give some help in creating, let's say, access points, keys, a database, so people will know that for the history of, let's say, the slave trade in Malabar, you should go to these and those places. So in the end, of course, it's still necessary that you can read the material in Dutch. But again, knowing, let's say, starting to know Dutch, I think it will be easier to get access to the archive and also experience how much progress you can make because you are already there where you want to be. And so I hope I explained why this is important, so that you get that you will be that you are able to move to the right place thanks to the database. Of course, what is accompanying this is that we need some, let's say, more scholars, more expertise on this topic, and also locally. So let's say the other part of the project is really targeted at capacity building. So it's about training experts that write a PhD. It's also about the exchange of staff and students, and also summer schools that we are going to organize together. By the way, I'm going back to this one because I think I should also stress that we are not only let's say, cooperated with the KCHR, but also with the Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit Studies, which I think is important to stress because we have some very good and interested colleagues and students from that university. And I think they also will play an important role in this whole capacity building aspect of the project. So training experts, in a way, it will be quite traditional. So people will come to the Netherlands to learn the language, to learn some paleography. They will do an MA in the Netherlands, but they also, that I think it's also important again to stress that some of the training will also take place in Kerala itself. So through these summer schools, and also because these experts that were trained in Leiden also will go back to KCHR and then will be able to continue training also locally. So I think what was missing so far is that especially at the local sphere, all the work that was done was not really connected to the grassroots of Kerala, so to say. So I think what is important to stress is this grassroots connections that we are seeking. And that also relates to source publications. So in order to, let's say, demonstrate the importance of the archive, what we have in mind is to produce some translated in English, perhaps also in Malayalam, that would also a possibility, to let's say, to publish some sources that highlight the importance of the Dutch material that is, well, we think is underused and underexploited at the moment. So these are the main objectives. So in a way, it's partly archival, but it's also about a lot of training, exchange, and also, by the way, also students will go from Leiden to Kerala, and also hopefully may also do some internships at various heritage spots in the region, so to say. So it is really about matching local and archival expertise. So what you see here was a picture that was made when I visited Kerala some years ago. Here we have a team of Dutch scholars, visitors, and also a team of local people sitting together surrounding the Dutch, let's say, atlas that I produced at about that time. So we were looking at all these places in the atlas and how we can connect these places to the topography in Kerala right now and at this moment as we speak, as we spoke at that time. So so it is really important that, let's say, archival expertise, that is something where of course the project is focusing on, but that it is really matched with people that have local knowledge. So all kinds of local knowledge is important, we think. Now, what kind of information you may expect in the Dutch materials? So as you know, the Dutch were important in some places like Cochin, other places like Kananur. But what is really important, I think, is that if you look at the historiography right now that is happening on the region of Kerala, to my personal taste, and now I'm really the observer and the outsider, I think what may be lacking is a kind of let's say bedrock information about states and dynasties, and let's say who were the rulers, when did they rule, who were the kings, and which it's there's, as you know, it's the whole, let's say, political landscape of Kerala is quite complicated in the 17th, 18th century. And I still think that, a very, in my view, very basic local information about political, economic, and social infrastructure. So I would say, let's say, the political substratum of let's say, early modern Kerala. I'm not saying it's missing, but there's still a lot of information in the Dutch archive about this. And it has been neglected because most of the Dutch historians, and there are not that many, but most Dutch historians who have worked on the region were actually interested in either commercial history, so let's say the pepper, or they were interested in, let's say, the Dutch communities. And the Dutch, let's say, the focus was really always on the Dutch and what they did. And I think already quite a lot of theses that I've supervised that start to say that, you know, I will not go into the matrilineal system because that's too complicated for me. And they just left it out of their thesis. And most of these students were Dutch students, you can imagine. So I think there's still a lot of work to do. And what is really crazy, personally, I think it's that, you know, of course, there is a lot of material on early modern Kerala history. There's also, perhaps you know that there's also a project that's called the Street Project that is opening up Syriac material on Kerala, and which I think, you know, it's very, very interesting. But these Dutchmen, they were, you know, ruling some cities in Kerala, but they also were trading. So of course, you know, they have a lot of information on their partners, so-called partners, and also the population that they exploited and that they ruled. And so that's why I also mentioned here slavery, because there's one colleague of mine, Alexander Gele, he was also a former student, who is now working on slave trade and slavery in Kerala on the basis of the, let's say, the judicial, let's say, material that is also in the archive. So it is possible to come very, very close to the day-to-day life of people. So also go beyond, let's say, the political, economic, and social infrastructure, also to, let's say, the daily life of Kerala families. I think that is, something I should stress. So it's not only about, so in a way, I think my next observation is also based on, perhaps on this slide, I'm not sure. So what you see here is a photograph, which I found very interesting and very, let's say, illustrating, you know, what Kerala is. It's a crossroads, right? So here it's a 16th century, probably 16th century statue of Christ, or some people would say, no, he looks like a Buddha. Then we have a lotus flower, and then we even have an Egyptian ankh sign, you know, there in the knot. So in a way, you know, Malabar is Malabar, and we should write about Malabar, and we should, you know, study local history, but we should keep in mind that Malabar is a hub in the Indian Ocean sphere, so to say. And so there is another map that shows you that, you know, of course, you know, I was thinking about a map that shows how Kerala is part of the Dutch East India Company, but Kerala is also part, and this is just an example, of the Church of the Church of the East. Often people also call it, you know, use different Nestorian church, whatever you like to call it. But I think the Church of the East is the best term. And there you can see already that, you know, Kerala is also part of a much wider network that links Kerala to Iran and to the Middle East, for example. And of course, you know, this is just one example. One I could also, here is a, you know, it's an example of the Christians, but you could also give a Jewish example or talk about the Muslim networks. So I don't know whether I should call them diasporic, because that's also a bit problematic. But we are dealing with Kerala, that is the hub of networks. So of course, the Dutch factory in Kerala was also part of the Dutch network, but we have more networks. And what is so interesting, I think, you know, as an observer, and if I, you know, I read a lot about what's coming out on Kerala, that overall the picture that you get is that it's very scattered. So we have people that work on the Jews, we have people that work on the Muslim diaspora, and we have people that work on other Muslim networks and on Christian networks. But what seems to be lacking is a kind of more integrated, let's say, picture of the 17th and 18th century. Perhaps that relates to the point that I wanted to make here, is that perhaps we need a kind of, let's say, social, economic, and political substratum that makes it easier and that will facilitate a more integrated, let's say, picture of Kerala. Because, for example, when I read about, let's say, the Jewish and the Christian and the Muslim networks, just an example, they hardly refer to each other. So it seems that we are dealing with Kerala, but it's very, very fragmented. And I think in opening up the Dutch archive, this may help to link them up. So, for example, again, the Christian network, we have a lot of publications, a lot of work on the 16th century, very interesting stuff. But it seems to not continue into the 17th century. When the Dutch come in, the Portuguese go out, And it seems that this simply is coming to a halt, which of course is not the case. So I think it would be great if not only people that are interested in local history, but also people that are interested in these networks, take a look at how the Dutch perceive these networks and describe these networks and do businesses with these networks. So in that sense, I think this period is also very, very exciting because it is a period of globalization. So for example, when the Dutch operate in Cochin, there's a Jewish community in Cochin. When the Dutch community in Cochin is connected to the Jewish community in Amsterdam, there is this kind of excitement, you know, oh, wait, wow, there's another Jewish community in Amsterdam, or the other way around, there's another community in Cochin. So let's rethink our common history. And so what you see is in the 17th, 18th century is also almost everywhere, a new renaissance of people that start to rethink as a result of the connections that are made, especially in this period. And of course, many of them are older than the 17th century, but again, you know, you can say they are reinvigorated in this period. So people start to rethink about their own identity. And these are processes of globalization or processes of vernacularization, if you like. And so I think the vernacularization aspect, I think most scholars that work on Kerala are very much aware of this aspect. And here, of course, in the pictures, you can see some of it. So here we have the Jama Masjid in Cochin, and that's very much, you know, at the door of the Dutch factory. So I'm very sure the Dutch have lots of information on the Muslim network that they are dealing with, they have to deal with as traders. So I think, so these are two very important reasons why Dutch is such an important language as a window on what's going on, not only in Kerala, but also, let's say, on an Indian Ocean-wide basis, but also why the archive is so important, and also for Kerala historians. So, so I should finish, more or less. So in a way, I think the archives comes home. So that's how I see it. So in a way, I think it has been too much, part of, let's say, Dutch historiography. And we have some good work, people like Hugo Jacob, and also, other people like Anjana Singh. She also did a very good work, some very good work on the town of Cochin. But I think we need more than just the Dutch perspective, and more than that, just the history of these Dutch communities and how they survived there and what they did over there. But that we need to go beyond this. So I just mentioned, I highlighted these 5 points. So it's important to have better access to and wider use of the Dutch archives. We need more local experts, archivists and historians. Well, this may sound for some of you extremely old-fashioned. So this guy is talking about facts in history, but I think it is important to improve our factual base. I think we have lots of people that produce, the wrong facts, and also I think as historians we should be aware that facts are produced, and we should, in that sense, also be aware of the post-colonial agenda. But at the same time, we also have facts, for example, about who ruled what in what period. So in a way, I think we, as historians, I personally still believe that we need a factual base, and which I also refer to as this political and social economic substratum that we need for Kerala history. At the same time, it will help to give us a more integrated picture of Malabar history. So I really applaud the initiative of iShore, where I think it's quite unique that we have so many scholars working in different fields coming together. And hopefully that produces indeed a more integrated picture. So of course, it's not, we should not have one picture. That's not what I'm suggesting, but it's a mosaic, but the mosaic should be seen as a whole. And keep in mind that Kerala is made also, like the Netherlands, is made through its global interactions. So the global is making the local. So that for me as a global historian is clear. It's not only clear for the Netherlands, it's also clear for Kerala. So we should zoom in, zoom out, look at the Indian Ocean, but also be aware of the local roots of things. And of course, we also hope that some of this project will disseminate, because we are scholars. And in my case, I'm really an amateur in the sense that if I would like to connect to Kerala, I should at least learn Malayalam to do this, let's say, successfully. And I hope also that, the project will also give rise for people to learn more Malayalam so that they are able to connect some of the results that come from, let's say, this more professional historical research, to translate that also into the so-called heritage sector, and perhaps also even teaching in Kerala. So yeah, that at least, that would be my ideal. So I think it's high time that, scholarship also tries to translate its results into the daily life of Kerala society, especially at this moment, when Divya said that it's a very difficult moment for the humanities in South Asia and perhaps also worldwide. So perhaps I should shut up here because it's long enough. And I would love to hear your question, comments, and first of all, of course, also listening to Professor Tharakan. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Gommans. Before we move on to a public discussion, I would request Professor Tharakan to provide his inputs. Please raise your comments and suggestions in the chat box.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Divya Kannan. I'm grateful to the organizers of this webinar, as well as the functionaries of this institute called iShore, to have invited me to function as a discussant to Professor Jos Gommans. Your subject itself is of great attraction to me personally, as well as to many others here, for the fact that it highlights one of the major issues that is being very widely and very intensely discussed, particularly in the circles of historical studies and research. The so-called Cosmos Malabaricus project is being shaped up on one side. Hopefully it will get the concurrence from both the government of Kerala as well as the government of India. We have already received the acceptance from the Kerala government and are waiting for the approval by the government of India. Hopefully it will come soon, and then we can talk about this project in a more exact contours. Now, instead of trying to be a real discussant, that is, trying to find out those issues which has already been presented by Professor Jos Gommans, which requires further discussion, I would rather choose an easy way out by supplementing some of his comments, by adding some very, to me, it looks like very, very important points to be discussed in this larger context. Let me start with my own personal introduction to the records in the Dutch archives. Way back in 1983, which is of course earlier than most of my listeners' birth, I happened to come to Holland, to Hague, to work in the Algemeen Rekenschrift, I presume I pronounced it correctly, in the National Archives, without knowing much about the Dutch language, its structure, its evolution, or most basically about its paleography and epigraphy. But nevertheless, I was interested in this Dutch Kerala connection or Dutch Malabar connection or Dutch West and India connection. I happen to be restrained by many things, particularly by the fact that the National Archives at that time wouldn't allow uh, copying the material except manually. So I used pencil and paper to draw as I saw the saw the saw the writings, and then take it outside and take it to my friends and ask them, because since it used the same kind of letters as it is used in English, I could very well guess what it is being talked about. And this is how I first had my encounter with the records available in the Dutch archives. But of course, I ran into problems once I brought it back to Kerala and tried to use it to quote it in some of my papers. And then I had to get a more exact translation for which there was nobody around. And finally, I located a young Dutch couple who claimed to know Dutch. Of course, they were Dutch, so they showed me, they told me that this is like this and this is like the other. But unfortunately, what I translated was far from the truth, and it was pointed out to me by some people who were much more well-versed in the Dutch 18th century Dutch language. From that day onwards, I was keen that there should be some way of being introduced to the language in which this, or the script in which these documents were drafted. So I talked to whomever I could, asked them what can be done. And of course it I had to wait for a long time to get some methods made clear to me. But one point I realized was that there were very few people. If I'm wrong, I would like to be corrected. I was under the impression that even in Netherlands, there were very few people who were well versed in the mid Dutch or the 18th century, 17th century Dutch, which was, I presume, this is what I was told, it was more influenced by other neighboring European languages, particularly German and all that. Anyway, we had a problem like that even in Netherlands itself. So you had to go through various hurdles to get a clear understanding of what can be done. After long years, after I retired from my regular service and all that, I got associated with an organization called the Muzuris Heritage Project, which was meant to develop, partly historical, partly cultural, partly tourist-oriented kind of relations with other nations of the world. And one of their ideas was to connect with 33 countries, which they claim to have had some association or the other throughout the centuries with the Kerala coast. They came in search of mainly of pepper and other spices, and also timber and other commodities. So these 33 countries were approached, and 19 of them responded very favorably. And one of the countries which was very, very open and very and welcomed this proposal very much was, of course, the Netherlands. And we had a couple of meetings with the Dutch personnel from the Dutch embassy, including His Excellency, the ambassador at that time. So I raised this issue with him, and he said that, of course, you should have more discussions with the Leiden University, and that was, of course, the way out to solve this problem. Now, one of the outcomes of this association between the Missouri's Heritage Project and the Dutch Embassy was that later on, when Their Majesties the King and Queen of Netherlands came on an official visit to India and of course to Kerala, to Cochin in 2019, Professor Keshav and Muralidharan, who was by then director of the ISHK, the Institute for the Study of Cultural History of the Coastal Kerala, and myself was the chairperson of the Kerala Council for Historical Research, were asked to make two formal presentations to them. And I took that opportunity to put across that this is one of the main problems, one of the main issues which most of the scholars working on inter-Dutch relations would be facing. And we have already come to know that in Leiden, there was a series of programs, starting with, of course, your TENAP and Encompass and others, which is already doing something in this line. I presume now I sometimes I use it to boast when I talk to my friends that I told the King and Queen of Netherlands that this should be done, and they were very. I wonder whether they even understood the language in which I was speaking, because my English was certainly not one of the best that could have been used to convey anything to them. Anyway, they took it, obviously, that delegation took it very seriously, and they, of course, put us on to Professor Jos Gommans, who was already working on this issue and working on these projects in Hague. And in addition to that, we had a very, very friendly Indian ambassador in Holland, Venu Rajamani, who happened to be a friend of the Center for Development Studies, where I was, and of course Divya Kannan would know the name much better than most of us, because this institute was one place where the Indian ambassador was very much closely associated with, and he was very, very helpful in promoting this idea of an inter-Dutch research initiative. Now, Professor Gommans and myself worked on a draft MOU in which some of the issues, which of course most of them has been dealt with by Gommans, but I would like to pinpoint one or two or three of them. One was that the necessity for the people from the west coast of India, mainly from Kerala and the Malabar and neighboring regions, to be familiar with the linguistic structure, the language, the evolution of language, the epigraphy, as well as paleography. Paleography becomes very, very important because, as you know, most of these documents are in handwritten forms. And this is a major area in which there should be very clear and very good kind of training available to people who want to look at this document. So that was one point. And the second was that the Dutch government has already been involved in uh, uh, providing some assistance to digitize some of the documents which are available in India. As already been said, both in Chennai, in Egmore, as well as in Ernakulam, in Cochin, there are regional archives where there are number of old Dutch records. So these records has to be digitized, and a wholly digitized Dutch archival collection should be made available to the whole world to look at and benefit and make studies on the period. Now, digitizing this thing may be a technical problem which can be handled if you have enough personnel and enough material equipments and all that. But in addition to that, the um digitization by itself need not familiarize the documents to the people who want to use it. Now, how do you make people who are interested in using this material know that these are available? And these one thing is, of course, publication. You publish this material not only in Dutch language but also in English, and we in the KCHR wanted them to be published also in Malayalam. So we have at least a three-prong publication strategy, which is being discussed and which is being agreed upon as far as the project is has evolved so far. So the publication should be of the first quality. It should be it has to be done in a extremely well orchestrated manner, and of course should be made available to libraries all across. Now this would be then of course one can think of other technological possibilities of digitizing itself, the publication itself, in the sense that you can put it into different forms of accessibility. Now, these two things, one is being familiar with the um, epigraphy as well as the paleography of the documents, and secondly, with the making them accessible to a larger number of people, not only in Kerala but also everywhere. And the third point is that when you have these kind of facilities available, you of course cannot enter into a study of these documents without some basic understanding of the historical context, which is of course every historian, not only historian, every social scientist knows. You have to be aware of the context in which these documents were created and why they were created in such forms and all that. So this is a major issue which is by our own predecessors in the previous generation who worked on these issues have discussed it quite widely. So this becomes a major issue of learning for those who are interested in this subject. Professor Tapan Raichaudhuri has pointed out that how the Dutch in Cochin differed from the Dutch in Sri Lanka or Ceylon, and also how they both differed from the Dutch in Batavia. So according to him, when all the three archival collections got merged into the National Archives in The Hague, it became a big boost to scholars, because you could recheck, whatever you read as part of the Ceylon collection, whether it matches with the Cochin collection or with the Batavian collection. They would have had different purposes and different interests. And interestingly, one of the points that has been much talked about is that when Aurangzeb came to power, the Dutch were interested only in the price of pepper in Cochin. The day on which Aurangzeb came to power, they were more bothered about price of pepper in Cochin. And I'm sure that the people are bound by their context, bound by their occupation, bound by their immediate purposes as well. So a study of the historical context study becomes also more important. All three are points which is worth repeating, because partly it has been referred to by Jos in his fairly comprehensive presentation. And these three points together would would bring forth much more than what we would be expecting to find in these documents. Not only that, the much of the medieval, and I'm calling it medieval because I don't have a clear-cut substitute for the word, the medieval Kerala history is now written on sources available within Kerala, and partly, of course, by international sources. But with the arrival of the Dutch sources, and the Dutch sources made available to the people in this fashion, where a group of young people, not only in the Netherlands and other parts of the world, but also from Kerala, from the region from which most of these documents came up. A group of people have been trained in these matters, and they can continue to work with both the KCHR and the Leiden University as interns, as scholars in residence, and develop this kind of a skill, a kind of a facility, which is so important for the understanding of the history of this period and this region. So I would stop here. I wouldn't. I've got a few more points to make, but I would rather make it, if there is the time available, when we have questions and answers. So thank you to all of you. Thank you very much. I hope you all will support this Inter-Dutch project on Cosmos Malabaricus and promote it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Michael Tharakan, for sharing both your personal challenges and interest in the project, apart from your wider academic interest. Before I throw it open, I just wanted to initiate a discussion on two concerns that I had while listening to Professor Gommans. Professor Jos, you mentioned about decolonizing the Dutch archive, and it reminded me of Anne Stoller's work in Dutch Java as well. And I was wondering, what does decolonizing entail for Dutch society at this moment? Because this has been a wider debate across Europe, as well as in post-colonial countries about decolonization. So what is the decolonization that the National Archives in Holland is looking at? And at the same time, will this translate into pedagogical changes in the classroom? Are Dutch universities envisaging the teaching more of South Asian histories in slightly different ways? We know in UK currently there is a heated debate on UK universities and schools not teaching the histories of race and slavery as much as they should be. So I was just wondering, and sorry because I'm ignorant of the current discussions in the Netherlands, of what are the pedagogical and academic concerns on the question of decolonizing the archive. And in relation to this, this is also a concern raised by Mahmood on many occasions, and I'm passing it on to both the speakers. Are there similar collections in Kerala on the Dutch? Are there any kind of archival collections in Malayalam? And if not, do you have any explanation of why there is an absence of similar collections in Malayalam on Dutch residents during the 16th to 18th centuries? So with those questions, I open the discussion to everybody else. Please do share it in public chat or privately with either Mahmood and me, and we will raise the questions. Professor Gommans, you may, if you would like to respond now, or if you'd like to take other comments. You will have to unmute yourself. Sorry, Professor Jos, we couldn't hear you. Could you unmute your chat?
I should unmute. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Divya. Thank you for your question. I think I take up the question about decolonizing the archive. I think in a way, I think it's an ongoing discussion which was started about a year ago. So I think what you see, let's say, in the, Dutch, the wider field of newspapers, of social media, etc. This is really becoming a very important, let's say, issue, which also divides the country. So I think it would. I don't think there's a kind of consensus about that the Dutch really need decolonizing their archive. So in that sense, it also splits the society. But for example, we had elections just the last week, and there was one party who got one seat in the parliament, which really makes this a very important issue. So that's, and I think, that is important because that party will remind all the other parties about how important it is. So the idea is that, so you can see it in terms of that people start to rethink, labeling street names, or also thinking about the teaching program at secondary and basic school level. So in that sense, I think people start to rethink about, what should be presented to the Dutch audience in general. But it's also clear, and there's more and more also attention for the role of the Dutch in, for example, the Atlantic slave trade, but also as far as the Dutch East India Company is involved, because the Dutch East India Company was also active in the slave trade in Asia. So this is really now in the newspaper, you find it in the social media, so it's really something that's becoming hot. But again, it's also splitting up the society. So you have, let's say, the conservatives don't like it at all. But that's also something you see in the UK, for example. So what is happening in the UK also is happening in the Netherlands, although with some delay, I would say, and also with some naivety that the Dutch still think that, the real culprits were the Brits and the Germans, and the Dutch were just, we never really had an empire, that kind of stuff. It's coming up. So, but in general, I think it's going in the right direction. I think it's going in the right direction. At the same time, although this is really hotly debated, kind of reflection on the Dutch role in colonizing people and exploiting people. At the same time, I don't see that the same people are also becoming more interested in South Asia, for example. So, so there's a kind of, for me, there's a kind of almost, it seems that, people are concerned about what's going on worldwide, and also the role that the Dutch played in the early modern period, but it doesn't trigger more interest into, let's say, local history of Kerala, or the local history of Indonesia, or the local history of China. So in that sense, I'm a little bit pessimistic. So yeah, so I'm ambivalent about this.
Okay, thank you. So there are some questions from the audience.
Yeah.
I will just read it out, or if Dr. Verghese would like to raise the question directly, please feel free to do so. Please let me know if you would like to speak up, Dr. Verghese. Okay, so I'm just going to read out the question for everyone, and Dr. Varghese is asking on similar lines. Thank you, Professor Gommans. Particularly like the two fundamental objectives of the project, archives coming home and decolonizing the colonial archives. His question is on the second one. You said the objective is not much to use this archive to write metropolitan history, but to use the corpus as a window to unravel the local and regional histories. Is it going to be done primarily through the method of reading against the grain, resistant reading? Or is it that there is a significant portion of the archival corpus produced by the locals? How far the Itti Achudan's case was not an exception? I'm going to just take another question along with this. This is from Renard Bess, who's from the National Archives in Netherlands. Do historians in Kerala here, particularly in this session, agree that the political history of 17th and 18th century Kerala is still partly unclear? Or as Jos phrased it, do we always know who ruled where and when, especially with regard to the smaller polities, Tekkumkur, Vadakkumkur, Kayunkulam, so on and so forth. So Professor Gommans, please go ahead with Dr. Varghese's question, and
Yeah.
Leonard's question is open to everybody, actually, for everyone else in the room.
Okay, so this question about how we should read that material, the Dutch material, is really, I think, an important question. If you talk about reading against the grain, it reminds me of subaltern studies and of Anne Stoler, and that. So I think it is important that we read against the grain, but at the same time, I think, and that's what I often tell to my students, we should also be able to read with the grain, of course. And so we should be aware that the 17th century is the 17th century, and that there are several centuries in between the 21st century and the 17th century. We should also be aware that the Dutch were one of the many, let's say, parties in Kerala that tried to survive there. So they had all kinds of contacts with people in Kerala. So I think we should not only, let's say, read European materials against the grain, but we should also read, let's say, Malayalam poems against the grain, although it would be a pity because a poem is not meant to be read against the grain, isn't it? So we need to read it also with the grain. But for me, it's always important to stress that we should do both. So in a way, I think, especially, I think if you are a newcomer to the field, you just learned Dutch, you are able to read, through paleography, the old script, and then you also need to read it against the grain. It's quite so. It's reading. So in a way, I think we need all this, but at the same time, I just wanted to stress that there are lots of basic things that are still there in the archive, and that also addresses Leonard Bess's question, and I hope to hear more about that from the local historians. So to what extent do we have a clear idea what is going on? So in a way, I think, of course, we need reading against the grain, a la Anne Stoler, but also I think we have a lot of ground to cover, in a sense that there's a lot, 99% of the archive has not been used by Kerala historians. So there's also a lot of, very basic stuff to do. And of course, you should be a good historian, so read against the grain. And also, I do agree that because I'm not, somebody who feels that the Dutch were just traders, especially not in Kerala. In Kerala, they were just colonial rulers, especially several of these states, some of these cities where they were really dominating. So in a sense, in that sense, you really need to have a kind of awareness that you are dealing with colonial rulers who try to map the area, and also make all kinds of mistakes because they map the area. And because, that is what, of course, the big theme of colonial history is, that colonial history is also about historical science. So it's also when you start to categorize people, it's also because you want to control people. So what I think makes the Dutch material also interesting is, from that point of view, to see that the Dutch were earlier than the English, and about at the same time, slightly later than the Portuguese, trying to administer a region. And of course, you should be very much aware of that is the background of what they do. But not always, not in each and every case that is the case. There are also people that really have a different agenda, and I don't write about Kerala because they want to rule it. For example, missionaries, or all kinds of let's say military people. So I'm not sure whether they always want to rule it and then have a certain idea about what's going on there. So all that is needed, but there's much more. So and then it's the question about the what do we know about the political infrastructure? That's for the others.
Yes. Also, Dr. Verghese had raised the question of how far Itti Achyutan's case is, is it an exception or not? Because we know locals also collaborated heavily, in fact, in the production of these colonial texts. So would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think, we're still at the beginning of things. So in a way, I think you cannot compare Kerala, for example, with Coromandel, because the Dutch were much closer as rulers to what was happening on the ground. So Itti Achyutan, I think it's an interesting case, and of course it's a darling of the history of science, because there we have somebody from the bottom up who is making a very important contribution to what later on becomes, a kind of modernity in Europe. So that's why the case is so well known. But I would say that the most promising part of this story is indeed the judicial materials, so coming from the Court of Justice. So we have all kinds of cases involving local people, also slavery. And I think a very interesting stuff is coming out of that, because they often have to tell, why they did certain things, and then they tell you exactly what's going on. I think also, perhaps Malabar can be compared to Sri Lanka in that sense, although Sri Lanka even has more information, even more on, let's say, on the grassroots, what's happening at the grassroots. But it's somewhere in between, let's say, Coromandel coast, so Tamil Nadu now, and Sri Lanka. So, but it's still, I think, because the Dutch were an economic and political player. There's also lots of very basic material.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jos. Professor Michael, would you like to respond to the second question that Leonard has raised, as well as to Mahmood's earlier concern of whether there are any equivalent material in the Kerala archives or elsewhere of Malayalam writings on the Dutch?
Yeah, there are collections of writings on the Dutch period. But of course, these writings are of more of a pedagogical type, in the sense that it is basically of a textbook type of writing. But nevertheless, some of those books are well noted for their wider usage by historians and other social scientists. Say like T.I. Punen wrote about, he had been to the Dutch archives, and also he was known to have been, according to some, an expert in this mid-Dutch, in the 18th century Dutch. Then, of course, there was this Dr. P.C. Alexander, who was Principal Secretary to the Prime Minister of India and then the Governor of Maharashtra, because he moved away from his historical research into administration. But nevertheless, he himself had some understanding of the Dutch archives and had used that for his studies on early Dutch Kerala trade. Then others have used, of course, translations of different type. Then, of course, Sardar K.M. Panikar is possibly the first person from Kerala to have worked in the Dutch archives. So there is a history of people from Kerala to have worked. But what I'm more I want to bring to the attention of all of you is that right now there is quite a bit of local historical research, very local historical research. See, for instance, 2 weeks ago, I happened to attend a workshop on a local history group who were discussing the activities of an 18th century, early 18th century Christian prelate, Christian bishop, who came from West Asia and remained in Kottayam in Kerala for about 20, 25 years or 27 years. he did not belong to any of the leading church factions. He belonged to, of course, this Church of the East, or the Chaldean Nestorian Church, which Professor Gommans mentioned. And he was so popular with the local people, including this was the period when the modern state of Travancore was not built up. So it was just before that. So there was this relatively free small kingdoms, say like Tekkenkur. And he became so popular in the Tekkenkur local economy and local social, local society. I've done some work on this, and I was interested in it. I went for that, and I found much more information coming forth from the relationship that he built up on the one side with the local rulers, and on the other side with the Dutch leader. And the Dutch, how did the Dutch appear in this? The Dutch appear because, unlike the Portuguese who were there before them, they didn't restrict themselves to the coastal region alone. They went inside. They moved inside to collect commodities, to transact commodities, and they had major presence in small, now, one can say small towns like Kottayam, Changanasheri, Pooñar, and Kanjirapalli. So this kind of a link up is made clear by some of the work that is going on.
Thank you so much, Professor Tharakan. It also reminds me, perhaps, if younger scholars are interested in looking at the descendants of some of the marital unions, perhaps between the Dutch and Malayalis on the coast, and some of the communities who may have preserved some of these sources. We have another question from Mithilesh Kumar. Mithilesh has a slightly long question, and it's a conceptual question. And it goes, how are we going to conceptualize oceanic histories by keeping our analytical lens both at the gateway or hub as well as the hinterland? I was wondering if the corrective to the Bengal-centric historiography is a Malabar/Kerala-centric history, or is it possible to think about this wonderful project by also thinking about how the hinterland is connected to the gateways and hubs? For example, we still do not know much about how a place like Patna in Bihar was connected through various and intricate networks of the Dutch Empire, especially through the river routes onto the sea and the ocean. The archive of a Calcutta or a Bombay or Cochin or Surat will be undoubtedly rich, but I think there is a case to be made for the still hidden archives of the hinterland, which actually fed the various networks which went into making of the hub by both labor and commodities. Apologies for the rather long comment. No apologies at all, Mithilesh. If Professor Gommans would like to respond to this.
Yeah, it's a very good question, I think. Of course, the story about Kerala is not unique in that sense. So I do agree that you can actually draw a similar picture about Patna. Although I should also say we are dealing with Cosmos Malabaricus because the Dutch material on Kerala is so rich. So it compares perhaps with Sri Lanka. We still have the factory archive of Malacca, but we have much more information about Kerala than about Patna, although there is a lot of information about Patna as well. So, and also, I had a student who also worked on Patna and about the Ganges River, the Ganga that connects, the Hindustan to Bengal. And it was a very interesting study. So, I'm not saying that one should be done and the other not. So in a way, I also think that, of course, the overall impression is that Kerala stands a bit on its own because it is focused on the ocean. And that's because of the Western Ghats. People think, this is a different kind of India. So, and also in Islamic studies, people point out that, this is a Shafi school of Islam, and then we should doubt whether that is really true. But okay, the Shafi school is not there in the north of India, which is Hanafi. So, but Shafi is there in the maritime world of Indian Ocean. So, and it also look at these mosques. that were built in Kerala, they look much more what we see in the Malay world than what we see in Bengal. So of course, I personally think these questions are important, and it raises the point whether or not Kerala should always be seen in the context of South Asian history, because it has a history that is oceanic. But at the same time, we also, I know it's a very sensitive issue also in Kerala, is that, we have a kind of Brahmanization that is happening, probably also 19th century and not at this early stage. I don't know. So again, I'm an observer, so I don't know what it, but of course, this has something to do with the things that I mentioned, that, at the moment, a community is connected to a community elsewhere, it starts to rethink what it really is, its own identity. So in a way, when we are dealing with these networks of Christians, Syrian Christians, of Jewish people, of Muslims, I think also let's say the Brahmin connections, perhaps in a different way, because in that case, perhaps texts are even more important than in the case of the Christians. But I think in the Christian case also, it is also about a kind of network that is being informed by texts that are distributed across the network. So, so in that sense, I think on the one hand, indeed, Kerala seems to be much more focused on the ocean, on the Indian Ocean, and its identity is a result of that, partly. But at the same time, we should not be blind for Kerala's connections beyond the Ghats. And especially in the southern part, I think these connections are very important. The Dutch were also aware of these connections and also often traveled across the Ghats from one coast to the other, like many traders did. So in a way, every region is a hub. And for me, what is really strange is that, the most fascinating material that is coming up recently about Malabar is its connections with the outside world. But they don't seem to connect to this, well, not enough, I would say, with an integrated idea about the local situation. And that is something we have to, I think we should think about. So for me, whether it's oceanic or overland, doesn't matter. But it is important that we realize that there is not, let's say, an Indian nation state. So Kerala should be seen in the context of South Asian history. Yes, certainly, perhaps for 75% it is, but it is also part of the Indian Ocean, of the history of the Islamic world, of the history of the Church of the East. But I think all these processes, so Brahminization, also the growing tension in Islamic circles as a result of the Hajj, and growing tensions about whether or not you're a Catholic loyal to Rome or whether you're a Catholic loyal to the Syrian church. Now, all these aspects should be seen as part of a 17th, 18th, 19th century phenomena that should be studied in connection. And hopefully, the Dutch material, it sounds weird, but hopefully the Dutch material will help, because at least the Dutch, they, I think, will open up areas that we don't know that much about.
Thank you so much, Professor Gommans. So I'm going to actually combine both Jaya's concerns and the sub-debate that is going on with Leonard on the side with actually Susan Vishwanathan's question before we get back to the question, Mohammad's question. And that is about translation itself. And so Jaya's concern was, will some of this be mitigated if the material could be translated into English? Of course, there is an entire politics of translation involved, and also the archives is not a neutral entity. There is a politics to the metadata that is also being created in the archives. So when scholars do go into the archives to search for the material, what will the metadata tell us is also a question. Related to that, but in a slightly different time period, is Professor Susan Vishwanathan's question on the differences between medieval language sources in this context. So if I can bring everyone's attention to Dr. Vishwanathan's question, how do Dutch scholars work with the difference in language between medieval sources and modern language usages? Something that Professor Tharakan had also mentioned. Can we send in request lists for translation selection privileges when required?
yeah, also some very basic questions which should be addressed. So first of all, I think Lennart already pointed out that that's a massive archive. So it's very difficult to translate everything, and it is indeed part of the project. I think at the moment we start off and we sit together as a growing community, we make decisions about which sources should be translated in Malayalam and in English. So I think that is important. They should also, trigger more interest among a wider audience. So we should select those sources that have a certain, interest also among the wider public. So in that sense, I think Professor Tharakan addressed an issue that is also important. Let me just give you a practical example. So lots of people that were in the program, in these Leiden programs, were not very fond of 17th century topics, because the script of the 17th century is much more complicated than the 18th century. So that's why you feel that, for example, for Indonesia, I think 90% of all the Indonesian students, because they can actually choose between early modern stuff, so that's late medieval for you, or let's say 19th century stuff. And they always opt for the 19th century because it's easy to read. So I think a problem is also, let's say, the script. The 17th century script is more difficult. At the moment, you would be able to easily read 17th century script. I think it's not that much more difficult than the 18th century stuff. So it's basically something that is related to the script. At the same time, there's also a lot of software is being developed as we speak, where perhaps in perhaps the near future, it will already be possible to get, the handwriting into TypeScript. So in that case, you have already a Dutch text, and I personally was hugely surprised some time ago when I used Google Translate on a Dutch text. And okay, you can certainly not read with the grain and also not very good against the grain, but you have some sense about what's there. So in that helps you in also selecting your material. But of course, it should not be an excuse of not learning the Dutch language. So that is still necessary. But there are lots of developments that are, I think, making life much easier. Let's say in 25 years' time, I think, I don't know whether this will be recorded, and you listen to me, I think you will be surprised how easy it is, perhaps, in 25 years. But we are not that far yet, so I think we still need a project like this. And so I also I really think that knowing the Dutch language is still important, and that we need Malayalam historians to master the language, especially if you want to read it against the grain, by the way. Because then you really, so I always keep stressing, students that come to Leiden always keep stressing that that students from India should do some field work, go into the Dutch villages, to integrate it to Dutch society, so they know, because they are reading Dutch sources made by Dutch people. So of course, if you want to really understand these texts, it helps if you know a little bit about from which context these Dutch were writing. So I myself wrote an article about how Van Rede looked at Kerala, and the way he described Kerala was very much based on how he looked at the Dutch society himself. So he actually copied his ideas, translated his ideas about Holland into Kerala society. So it helps really if you know a little bit about Dutch history, reading these sources. It's not easy, but I know there's a lot of talent. So there's much more talent. Many people that have much more talent than I have. So yeah, so I think it's necessary to train them, especially in the language.
Thank you. There's a question from Muhammad Ali. What were the contributions of the Dutch to globalized theological literature of Islam generated locally in Malabar? So this is a more specific question about, if you could throw light on any Dutch sources.
I cannot throw light. I don't want to suggest that the Dutch were themselves actively participating in this. I just want to say that the Dutch were having links with these communities. And that now, for example, we have a person like, a very important Muslim person in the archipelago is Sheikh Yusuf. So Sheikh Yusuf was actually revolting against the Dutch. He was also a Sufi, but also, an alim. So he was somebody who really was into theology. He was actually sent to Sri Lanka. From Sri Lanka, he was sent to the Cape. I can imagine that we have more of these kind of people. There will not be that many, but nobody has looked for them. So Mahmoud did try once, I think, but he was also very much at the beginning of his traineeship, so to say, and then later on started to do something else. But I think he just started looking for that for this, and I'm quite sure that at some time, it needs time. But we have all kinds of connections with the Jewish, the Christian, and also the Islamic communities. I think perhaps more the Jewish than the Christians, because the Dutch, linked easier to them than the Muslims. But we simply don't know. I think we should start.
Okay, thank you. So we are coming towards the end. If anybody has any final questions or comments, please do share. I had a technical question actually for Professor Tharakan and for Professor Gommans. Since the project will involve the training of students in Leiden for language, especially for language training, can there also be a program based out of Kerala if students could learn the language in Kerala with the support of Dutch teachers or Dutch resource persons? Because I was just wondering of a larger audience who may not be able to travel to Leiden but would still like to learn it back home in their universities, if that is under consideration. And if Leonard would like to add something about the project, we do have some time left, a few minutes, if you would like to add something, or we could move on to the final phase of the program.
Yeah, I would like to say something. I just typed this comment in the chat box where I said it would also be really good if people with different linguistic skills work together. For instance, people who know Malayalam or Dutch. Because I really believe that a combination of different sources yields the best results. So I think, on the one hand, I think it's wonderful if people from Kerala learn Dutch, and I guess we as Dutchmen should also try to learn Malayalam. But I did try to learn some Tamil in the past, and it was a big disaster. But of course, you can also work together. So we all know the work of Schulman, Narayana Rao, and Subramanyam. And they bring together this whole linguistic scala of possibilities, and that really works well. So apart from the plans that have been mentioned today, I think there could also be a platform maybe where people from Kerala who know Malayalam and people from the Netherlands who know Dutch work together. Because I know from my own research that if you combine Indian sources and Dutch sources, it's really 1 + 1 makes 3. Because you can put the different linguistic sources in each other's context, and you really get a much better picture of what happened. So what I would also like to see is that maybe there could be some kind of platform where you could look for people with other linguistic skills, and you can try to work together on a particular topic. So I'm planning to work on royal courts in Kerala. Hence my question about what do we actually know about 17th and 18th century Kerala politics. But of course, I can't read all these old Malayalam texts, these Vamshafalis that were produced by these courts. I would love to work with someone who can actually read that stuff. So I think that might be also part of this project. Okay, that's what I would like to say.
Yeah, thanks so much, Leonard. Professor Michael Tharakan, would you like to provide any concluding remarks?
Let me before Michael starts, let me just stress that the projects should trickle down to, let's say you were saying, is it a bit elitist? So in a sense, of course, what we have in mind is to have these courses in Kerala, and perhaps also online. So we should start somewhere. So that's certainly what we have in mind. Michael.
You see, Professor Istvan Purcell, who has worked on the more or less the same period, had put forward a kind of a tentative hypothesis that at that time, 17th, 18th century Kerala ports or Western Indian ports, the lingua franca was a combination of Syriac or Aramic language with Arabic or Malayalam. and he has come out with a number of texts written in this combination, and which were also part of the general commercial official kind of transactions. This is one thing which we have to be aware of. And second is that there are, again, I'm referring to my good friend, Professor Keshavan Velathat, who thinks that there are a number of Dutch loan words in Malayalam. So it means that this was a period when there was language-wise or in terms of communication, there was a whole lot of interaction between the two groups. Now, this, of course, to say that it has happened in the past is would mean a thing if we don't have a scheme for repeating it or trying to repeat it in the present day. This thing. No, so I think the Cosmos Malabaricus itself would allow some selected scholars who would be working with the, I would expect Professor Jos Gommans to correct me if I'm wrong. At least the selected students would be given the chance to learn Dutch language. And of course, learn it with its other necessary components like epigraphy and paleography. Now, if they can become a starting group, one could build up a group of people with enough capabilities in both languages, both from the Dutch side as well as from the Kerala side. This is a possibility that we can very seriously think of. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Tharakan. It's also timely that Mahmood has just announced that in 1 hour, there is going to be a workshop on Malayalam and Dutch loan terms like kakus in Leiden. So if anybody is interested from shifting from this talk to that, you're more than welcome. Before I hand over the mic to Meera for the vote of thanks, also just to remind the audience that perhaps this calls for wider conversations and dialogues with scholars beyond our region. We often tend to speak in such echo chambers or look at our own regions. We hope this is a beginning for larger collaborations, of course, but also interesting dialogues and debates. And also with scholars who are working on other language sources. So I'm aware of Ananya Chakravarti's work. She's currently at George Washington University, and she's now looking at Portuguese sources on the Western coast in Goa and in Malabar. So it'll be interesting to pull in scholars in the field here as well. Over to you, Meera.
Thank you, Divya. I think we can all agree that this was a very successful inaugural session of iShore. And I would like to thank Professor Jos Gommans and Professor Michael Tharakan sir for giving us detailed overview of what Cosmos Malabaricus would be. And though Divya said it's a very difficult time for humanities, I think we can agree that the research is showing definitely signs of hope and we are moving in the right direction. I would like to also thank Divya for doing a wonderful job of chairing this session today. And also I hope Mahmood is feeling much better, who was quite stressed about making this successful. And all the other iShore members who worked behind the scenes to make this inaugural session a success. And more importantly, all the wonderful people who have joined us and made sure that you engaged in this topic and give lots of comments and questions. We value your feedback. And we hope that you continue to follow our Facebook page. And let me also quickly remind you that our next webinar will be on the 20th of April by Dr. J. Deviga. So we hope to see you again for all the webinars. And please follow our Facebook page if you haven't already. And we hope to have your support in future also. And yeah, I think that's it from our side. Anything you want to add, Mahmood?
No, I just wanted to thank everyone, especially Professor Gommans and Professor Tharakan for the wonderful, session. We really loved listening to you both. And I hope this would be like, a good beginning for a long-term collaboration, as Leonard mentioned, like not only in terms of language, but also on several other fronts as well. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Kuria and Dr. Meera Muralidharan, for all the nice things that has been said about me. Hope to see you again at such functions and at such gatherings. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. You're mute, Jos.
Did you say anything?
I just would like to thank everyone as well.
Oh,
So
okay.
it was really nice to be there, and also to have I really liked our conversation, and hope to see you soon again,
Definitely.
wherever that will be. Yeah.